The Bennett family's quiet life. In the early 1980s, the Bennett family led a peaceful small-town life in the quiet community of Fairfield, located in California. The family consisted of 43-year-old Ronald Bennett, a hardworking and dependable father, his wife, 41-year-old Sharon Bennett, who was a loving and caring mother, and their two children, 12-year-old Jessica and 8-year-old Anthony. Ronald worked as a mechanic, while Sharon took care of the household and children. To the outside world, the Bennetts seemed like the picture of suburban contentment. They were well known in their community, loved by neighbors, and actively involved in local events. Despite their modest lifestyle, the Bennetts were known for their warmth and hospitality, often hosting gatherings and offering assistance to those in need. However, on a cold December night in 1981, their idyllic life would come to a tragic end. In a brutal and senseless attack, the entire family was murdered in their own home, leaving the small community reeling with shock. The crime remained unsolved for years, and the investigation went cold, leaving the family's tragic fate a haunting mystery for decades. The Gruesome Discovery. On December 8, 1981, a relative of the Bennetts grew concerned when they couldn't get in touch with the family. The lack of communication seemed unusual, and it prompted the relative to call the police for a welfare check. When officers arrived at the Bennett family home, they discovered a horrific scene that would haunt the town for years. Inside, the bodies of Ronald, Sharon, Jessica, and Anthony were found brutally murdered. All four family members had been bludgeoned with blunt objects, and their bodies were arranged in a disturbing manner. The scene was chilling, an unimaginable act of violence that left investigators scrambling for clues. It was clear that the crime had been a targeted attack, but the motive remained unclear. There were no signs of forced entry, which led authorities to believe that the killer was someone familiar with the family. The police were left with few leads, and the investigation turned into a complex and frustrating puzzle. Initial investigations and dead ends. In the early stages of the investigation, police focused on a variety of potential leads. They interviewed neighbors, friends, and acquaintances of the family, trying to piece together any information that could point to a suspect. However, no one could offer a clear explanation for the brutal killings. The lack of forced entry into the home suggested that the family had been acquainted with the perpetrator, but this lead offered little in terms of a concrete suspect. Investigators also explored the possibility of a robbery gone wrong, but there was no evidence to suggest that anything of value had been taken from the home. The murder weapon was never recovered, and forensic evidence at the scene didn't provide any immediate breakthroughs. With no apparent motive and no solid leads, the case grew colder by the day. Suspects and theories surfaced. As time passed, various theories emerged about who could have been responsible for the brutal killings of the Bennett family. Early on, there was speculation that the murders might have been linked to a previous crime in the area. Some wondered if a serial killer had targeted the family, as there were a few similar unsolved crimes in the region around the same time. Others believed that it might have been an inside job, with someone close to the family being involved. Perhaps a disgruntled employee of Ronald's mechanic business, or a family member with a hidden agenda was the killer. There were also whispers about potential disputes within the family or financial troubles that could have led to violence. However, as the years went by, none of these theories proved to be true. A cold case and a community in mourning. As the years passed, the Bennett family massacre became a cold case. The community in Fairfield struggled to move on from the horrific event, but the lack of answers left everyone with an unsettling sense of fear and sadness. Ronald and Sharon's surviving relatives were left grappling with grief, unable to find closure. The case was periodically revisited by the local police, but new evidence was scarce, and fresh leads never seemed to materialize. The mystery of who could have committed such a brutal crime weighed heavily on the small community, and rumors continued to swirl. In 1989, the case was officially classified as cold, and the investigation went dormant. The names of the Bennett family victims were added to the growing list of unsolved murders, their story fading from public consciousness. However, deep down, many in the community hoped for the day when the case would be reopened, and the truth would finally come to light. Advances in forensic technology. In 2011, after nearly 30 years of uncertainty, new forensic technology emerged that would breathe new life into the investigation of the Bennett family massacre. Advances in DNA testing and genetic profiling offered investigators a chance to re-examine the case with fresh eyes. New methods of evidence collection and analysis have the potential to uncover vital clues that had been missed in the initial investigation, including DNA samples that had been collected from the crime scene, but never fully analyzed. The hope was that these advances in technology would finally unlock the mystery and bring justice to the Bennett family. The case was handed over to a team of cold case detectives who began to methodically review old files, re-interview witnesses, and reanalyze forensic evidence. It was a new beginning for the investigation, one that would ultimately lead to the breakthrough that had eluded authorities for decades. A breakthrough. DNA evidence identifies the killer. In 2014, after years of painstaking work, the breakthrough that investigators had been hoping for came when DNA evidence was finally able to identify the killer. Using advanced genetic profiling techniques, forensic experts were able to match DNA found at the crime scene with a suspect who had never before been linked to the case. The DNA sample led authorities to an individual who had previously been a minor person of interest in the investigation, but at the time there was not enough evidence to formally charge them. The new DNA results, however, were irrefutable. The person identified was 53-year-old Joseph H. Johnson, a man with a history of violent offenses and a connection to the Bennett family. Johnson had been a former acquaintance of Ronald Bennett, and he had been one of the many individuals interviewed during the initial investigation. But back then, his alibi had checked out, and there was no direct evidence linking him to the murders. However, after 30 years, the DNA evidence painted a different picture, implicating him in the brutal killings. Joseph H. Johnson, a troubled past. Joseph H. Johnson's criminal history began to surface as investigators dug deeper into his past. Born in California, Johnson had a long history of criminal behavior, including charges of assault and robbery. In the years leading up to the Bennett family massacre, Johnson had been known to associate with individuals who were involved in organized crime. Although he had never been convicted of any violent crimes prior to the murders, his violent tendencies were well documented. Investigators discovered that Johnson had worked with Ronald Bennett on occasion and had visited the Bennett home several times. It was unclear whether there was any personal animosity between the two men, but Johnson's volatile personality and troubled past painted a disturbing picture. After serving time for previous offenses, Johnson had been living under a different name when the DNA evidence finally linked him to the scene of the murders. The re-examination of his past and his connections to the Bennett family painted a chilling portrait of a man capable of unimaginable violence. The arrest of Joseph H. Johnson. On April 25, 2015, after the DNA match identified him as the perpetrator, Joseph H. Johnson was arrested for the brutal murders of the Bennett family. The arrest shocked the community as Johnson had been living quietly under a new identity for years, avoiding the attention of law enforcement. When authorities took him into custody, Johnson initially denied any involvement in the murders, but as the evidence mounted, his story began to unravel. Investigators uncovered details that suggested Johnson had planned the attack in advance, though the exact motive remained unclear. Some speculated that the murders were a result of a botched robbery, while others believed that personal grudges were the driving force behind the killings. Regardless of the motive, Johnson's arrest brought the town of Fairfield some much-needed closure after 3 decades of uncertainty. The arrest also brought renewed attention to the case, as the community finally began to understand the events that had led to the horrifying massacre. The trial and conviction. In 2016, Johnson stood trial for the murders of Ronald, Sharon, Jessica, and Anthony Bennett. During the trial, the prosecution presented overwhelming evidence that connected Johnson to the crime. The DNA evidence, along with witness testimonies and forensic analysis, painted a clear picture of Johnson's involvement in the brutal murders. The defense, while attempting to cast doubt on the evidence, struggled to present a credible alternative explanation for the DNA match. After a tense and emotionally charged trial, the jury found Johnson guilty of all charges. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. While the conviction brought some sense of justice for the Bennett family, it could never replace the lives that had been lost. The trial marked the end of a long and painful journey for the victims' families, but it also served as a reminder that even the most unsolved crimes can eventually be solved with perseverance and advancements in forensic technology. The Bennett family, while gone, had not been forgotten, and justice had finally been served.